This is Rwanda and Burundi. These are two countries which I like to call twins, like the Koreas, Sudans, and this very non-controversial area. Sure, the countries I mentioned hate each other to the bone, but Rwanda and Burundi, compared to other African countries, are special due to the fact that they're homogeneous, kinda. Rwanda and Burundi are very ethno-linguistically similar, with Rwanda speaking Kinyarwanda and Burundi speaking Kirundi. These two countries are divided into social groups. There are three important big ones, the Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa, which will be really important. Rwanda is a fast developing economy, soon to become one of the world's most developed countries. Meanwhile, Burundi? Oh, it's not that good. This country is poor, having a GDP per capita of $260. They aren't the poorest country in the region, their continent, or their half of the world. No, they're the poorest country in the world. They trade 9 times less than their Rwandan counterparts and having a more primal economy. Though that doesn't really mean much, considering that they still don't export shit. Considering that the UAE are both of these countries' largest export partners, something fishy is definitely going on, pun intended. But to figure this out, we need a bit of backstory. So let's walk a trail on the land of 1,000 hills. The region is one of the first to be inhabited by modern humans, with the Twa being the first people in the area, followed by the Hutu, who were Bantu in around the 14th century, and the Tutsi, who were Nilots around the 16th. The terms Tutsi, Hutu, and Twa didn't really have a lot of meaning at this time. In pre-colonial Rwanda and Burundi, they were mostly used to identify different sectors of society. The Tutsi were mainly pastoralists, the Hutu were agriculturalists, and the Twa being hunters and trappers. These labels were contextually created rather than hierarchical or ethnic. One example would be the Inagbo, who were children of former warriors who only had to pay taxes to their local chief and had no further obligations. They didn't really identify as Tutsi or Hutu. At about the 1400s, modern agricultural practices started to become commonplace, coming from Buganda and Busoga. Agriculture was the most important thing and influential part of both of these nations' histories. Rwanda and Burundi, like other African states, like the Luo, Luba, and Buganda, formed the nation-state, forming the Kingdom of Rwanda and Burundi respectively, which were ruled by the minority Tutsi around the late 19th century. The kingdoms of Rwanda and Burundi expanded, taking up lands of other ethnic groups. These two kingdoms were quite centralized for their small size. The land is characterized by steep hills that rise to the altitude of 4,000 meters. The eastern parts facing Lake Victoria were more populated than the shorelines of Lake Kivu and Tanganyika, because of the Albertine mountain range flowing to the east, making these areas more suitable for agriculture and pastoralism, which were the main sectors of these two kingdoms' economies. But don't be mistaken, these two small kingdoms were quite influential in their region. Being at the crossroads of Congo and Nile states, the Albertine mountains caused a drastic divide between the two cultural areas. Due to this, the Imbo region was very difficult to control and a headache to the ruling royals of Burundi, with the region being self-sufficient and the source of many rebellions. Same with Rwanda, but for the opposite reason. The Northwest Mountains were too lightly populated to be able to assert any dominance over. Burundi had more of a split between their tripartite groups, with them having their own divisions and to add to the different regions, having different identities and rituals added to the whole mix as well. The same applied for Rwanda, making these two societies quite fragmented. But Burundi was united under multiple princely states. Despite the regional differences, the political power of these kingdoms laid in the central highlands, being managed by 3 types of chiefs: cattle chiefs, land chiefs, and military chiefs, with Nyanza being the Rwandan capital and Gitega for Burundi. I could ramble all day about these two pre-colonial societies. But something bad would happen to Rwanda. In this time period, the king died, there was a drought, and a massive smallpox epidemic broke out in the nation. Large amounts of cattle died, a mass migration from the droughts struck east to the hills in the west, and political turmoil in the kingdom caused by a power vacuum. The European influence in Rwanda was basically non-existent. Apart from a few raids by neighboring kingdoms using guns bought from the Europeans, alongside this, British forces started to take an interest in the region after a long brutal 27-year war against the Kingdom of Buganda.
Hello.
Who the hell are you and what the hell are you doing here?
I'm here to look for the source of the Nile.
It's not here, so piss off.
Wait, what?
10 years later.
Guten Tag.
For the millionth time, the source of the Nile isn't here.
Take me to your leader.
Okay.
What the Sigma?
Look, I got an offer for you.
Okay.
If you become a protectorate, you get political, administrative and military protection from US.
Okay. Not like I have any other choice. The Germans merged Rwanda and Burundi into one region as Rwanda-Burundi. Being a province in German East Africa, both of their protectorates would be ruled via local kings by indirect rule. During German colonialization, the colonial administration started using Tutsi, Hutu and Twa as different ethnic groups, instead of as social groups as they were used for centuries. The Germans saw the Tutsi as more civilized as the Bantu Hutu, believing that the Tutsi were descendants of Hamitic peoples from Ethiopia. Of course, this was a lot of bullshit.
The region is one of the first to be inhabited by modern humans.
And about their more Eurocentric features, usually being taller and having lighter skin than the Hutu. The populace used extablished terms to characterize these ethnic groups. If the ruling lineage were Tutsi, then all Tutsi were presumed to be powerful. And if some Hutu were landless, then all would have been presumed to be living at the edge of poverty. These assumptions in society were more intense in Burundi. Germany put natives into forced labor camps, which caused a rebellion in Rwanda.
What you doing here?
So, I'm gonna declare war on Serbia for assassinating our Archduke.
Are you for real? Count me in.
This is gonna be a piece of cake.
Knock knock.
Who's there?
800,000 German soldiers.
Preposterous.
This will be a piece of cake.
To put it shortly, Germany was absolutely railed in the African theater, kind of forgetting that they were surrounded and would later lose the First World War. It was forced to give away its colonies, Germany East Africa was divided, Britain took Tanganyika, and Rwanda-Burundi was given mandate status by the League of Nations to Belgium. Now you might think, from now on it gets better, right? It just gets worse. The Belgian colonial government issued out identity cards differentiating Tutsi, Hutu, and Twa. The Belgians segregated education, with Tutsi receiving higher quality education in French, and the Hutu getting lower quality education in Kiswahili. Government positions were given to Tutsi, while Hutu were put into labor jobs. The Belgians used the colony for coffee and some famine-resistant crops, like cassava, yam, and European potatoes. The Belgian government used labor from Rwanda-Burundi to fuel production in the Congo. You know, after killing 10 million people. As you could expect, this caused a lot of tension between the Tutsi and Hutu, who now saw themselves as different from each other, fueling resentment within the Hutu against the Tutsi. A classic divide and conquer method. In 1940, the Belgian government felt like Rwanda-Burundi was not ready for independence, and not capable enough to rule themselves. Let's be honest, it's about the resources. It's time for decolonialization. What? My gold mine! I mean, yay. They didn't have real independence anyway. I think I'll hold on to this. Oh wow, who could expect? People don't like being subjugated. The Belgian government came to realize that they could no longer control their colonies. Party of the Hutu Emancipation Movement, aka Parme Hutu, led a revolution in Rwanda which deposed the monarchy, ending centuries of royal rule. To put a long event shortly, the king died during his visit to the doctor, and then Tutsis thought he was assassinated, So in revenge, they beat a Hutu politician to death. And that started the revolution deposing the whole monarchy. The Hutu, after hearing the death of their politician, started genociding the Tutsi, killing about 100,000. Many would flee to southern Uganda. This is only the beginning. One paragraph wouldn't do this event justice. In Burundi, the Union for National Progress attempted to mediate Hutu and Tutsi claims. Belgium was not able to dim down the unrest in Rwanda, Burundi, and at the urge of the UN and dissent in Burundi, split the territory, giving way to two independent countries, renaming the two from Rwanda and Burundi back to Rwanda and Burundi. Rwanda held a referendum to become a kingdom or republic, and the republic won by 80% in a 95% turnout in 1961. With Rwanda gaining independence as the Republic of Rwanda and Burundi as the Kingdom of Burundi, both on 1st of July 1962. Shortly before independence, Prince Rwagasore was assassinated by Belgium, killing the figure of Burundian nationalism. Now remember a couple moments earlier when I spoke about the Parme Hutu started the revolution deposing the whole monarchy. The Tutsis in Burundi wanted to ensure that wouldn't happen to them, and so the monarchy placed military and security position to Tutsis. Oh, did I almost forget the Cold War? Rwanda sided with the United States and Burundi sided with China. The Cold War wouldn't really affect these two countries, considering they were just hills. The Burundian monarchy refused to recognize political gains made by Hutu politicians, and in response, a Hutu militia attempted a coup in 1965, which failed. And in turn, the government started assassinating Hutu intellectuals and politicians. In 1966, the Mwami Mwabutsa was overthrown by his son Tari V, and a couple months later, in November, his prime minister would overthrow him. The new military government led by Misembero ended the monarchy and established a republic. Now, here's where it gets more confusing. The Tutsi in Burundi were separated into cliques. The Banyaruguru, a clique residing in the north of the country, were accused by the Hima, the ruling clique, of conspiracizing. A military-led tribunal sentenced 9 Banyaruguru to death. The government, fearing a Banyaguru-led coup, brought back the king from exile, which was a rallying point for the Hutu to rebel. On April 1972, a Hutu rebellion in the south of the country, where the Hima mainly reside, started slaughtering Tutsi civilians. The motives for this were most likely the contempt for the Tutsi-led government. The government, hearing about this, sent the military to the countryside, getting assistance from neighboring Zaire. As one Africanist stated,
"What followed was not so much a repression as a hideous slaughter of Hutu civilians. The carnage went on unabated through the month of August. By then virtually every educated Hutu element, down to secondary school students, was either dead or in flight."
By September the same year, 300,000 Hutus had already been killed and another 300,000 fled the country to Tanzania. In 1976, Jean-Baptiste Bageza took power in a bloodless coup. Though he had a Tutsi majority military, he promoted land reform, electoral reform, and a new constitution in 1981. And then after a rigged election, he was the only candidate. He suppressed all religious freedoms and put human rights in the garbage. In 1978, another coup would happen and Major Pierre Buyoya, the new leader, dissolved opposition parties and suspended the 1981 constitution. Tensions between the army, Hutu opposition, and Tutsi hardliners rose. During this period, about 150,000 people died and thousands fled to neighboring countries. In 1986, coffee prices crashed, essentially killing both economies since coffee were their largest markets. In 1991, Buyoya made a new constitution giving way to elections, non-ethnic government, and parliament. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves and look at its northern twin Rwanda. Remember the referendums, right? Well, after becoming a republic, the Parme Hutu, led by Kayibanda, became the ruling party. A Tutsi militia from Burundi started an invasion. The relations between Burundi and Rwanda were practically non-existent. The Parme Hutu killed about 13,000 people. In the infighting, about 70,000 people died. Kayibanda started peaceful negotiations to solve internal conflict, develops relations with 43 nations, everything going good. Then his administration tried getting more Hutus into schools. Sounds good, right? They just kicked out Tutsis from schools, only allowing schools to be 9% Tutsi. With high unemployment through the country, competition for these opportunities just kept heightening ethnic tensions. Following the violence, the Parmehutu banned all opposition parties, mainly the Tutsi-led UNAR, and executed 3 members. The Catholic Church was closely linked with the Parmehutu, having close links and sometimes assisting the Parmehutu via supporters in Belgium and Germany, with 2 of the main news networks in the country being Catholic publications. And this wasn't any independent church, this one was affiliated with the Vatican. In 1973, a military coup led by Major General Juvenal Habyarimana overthrew Kayibanda. He dissolved the National Assembly and heavily suspended all political activities in the country. He abolished the quota system, winning support amongst the Tutsi. And then he went back on his words, doing the same quota policy but with medicine and education. Many Tutsis were forced to resign and go into exile. Many Tutsis would also be killed during this period. Habyarimana saw himself as a peasant, the Hutu as peasants, and the Tutsi as petty bourgeoisie who were too lazy to till the land, who were put in power by colonialists. Habyarimana set policies on promoting national unity and development, also wanting to double Rwanda's population. In the new program, there was a new constitution which effectively made Rwanda a one-party state. Now what Habyarimana means by development is not what you have in your head. It's only development that increases power for the elites and the rulers. Habyarimana believed that Rwanda had to be an agricultural economy and self-sufficient, banning all food imports. He developed coffee and tea cultivations, not cassava or potato or anything actually edible. It wasn't for the benefit of the people, but just for the government to make more money from taxation. In 1988, tea prices plummeted, food security of export crops declined, and food security was clearly not on the government's agenda. Seen in the south, the ideology of Habyarimana promised the Hutu majority a mono-ethnic state, owned by the peasantry. Rwanda was soon to become the Khmer Rouge of Africa.
Isn't auto-development, before everything else, the exhaustion of our living forces? Isn't auto-development essentially the mobilization of all our living forces for a development, a progress, a national management of the challenges of our country?
So he got this. Habyarimana's regime depended on agricultural growth, but not for the people obviously, putting nearly the whole workforce into agriculture, which could have been done by half of the population. 97% of Rwanda's population was rural, from 1973 to 1995. Habyarimana thought cities as places of immorality, prostitution, and theft. These teachings were similar to the ones of the Catholic Church. I'm Catholic, so you can't call me out. In 1986, refugees who fled Rwanda, most of them Tutsi, were told that they were not allowed back in, arguing that the country wasn't big enough. 2 years later, the RPF would be created in Uganda. Might look small now, but it'll be big later. The regime's intentions would be shown in its propaganda, and some characteristics associated with 2 groups.
Did you know that 85% of the inhabitants of Kigali are Tutsi? When they expelled all the unemployed from the city, only the Hutu remained. The Tutsi have obtained working permits because their brothers confessed that they used them in their households.
Now that power was concealed and with ethnic tension within the country going to a boiling point, genocide soon became an option to consolidate power. The government closed all borders, preventing anybody from leaving the country, and planning something sinister. Quick, we need to discuss Uganda. Now prior to this, in 1986, Museveni won the Ugandan Bush War, and 2 veterans fighting for the NRM, Fred Rwigema and Paul Kagame, founded the Rwandan Patriotic Front. The RPF was a Tutsi-led rebel group consisting of mainly Tutsi veterans from the earlier mentioned conflict. On the first day of October 1990, the RPF invaded Rwanda. The government forces, supported by France, Belgium, Zaire, kicked the RPF out of the country. Rwigema died during the second day of fighting. France, Belgium, Zaire, and South Africa, and Egypt supported the government in the conflict. Kagame came back from the US and later retreated from the Virunga Mountains, led a guerrilla operation in the country for 2 years and ended in a stalemate. Protests forced President Habyarimana, despite disruptions and Hutu power killings, the Arusha Accords were signed, only by international pressure. being mediated by the OAU, all neighboring countries, Senegal, France, Belgium, Germany, the USA, the UK, Canada, the Netherlands, and the EU. But not many people had hopes in the Accords, as one human rights lawyer said.
The human rights workers, whether Rwandan or international, were not fooled. We did not think that someone capable of organizing massacres would suddenly turn into a Democrat. We saw what was happening. We kept telling the Belgian authorities.
Nonetheless, RPF forces were set in Kigali and a UN mission to mediate the tensions and one event to burn everything down. On April 6, 1994, a plane with Rwandan President Habyarimana and his Burundian counterpart, Cyprien Ntaryamira, was shot down by a surface-to-air missile, preparing to land at Kanombe International, now known as Kigali International. A Rwandan soldier in Kanombe recalled,
"You know, its engine sound was different from other planes. That's the president's engine sound. We were looking towards where the plane was coming from, and we saw a projectile, and we saw a ball of flame or flash, and we saw the plane go down. And I saw it. I was the leader of the block. So I asked the soldiers to get up, and I told them, get up, because Kinani has been shot down. They told me you are lying. I said it is true. So I opened my wardrobe, I put on my uniform, and I heard the burglar's sound."
It's disputed if the RPF shot down the plane or not. The bulge sound made the government forces think that the RPF had attacked, and shooting started in Kinombe, and explosions at the camp. The senior for the Kigali administration zone was out of the country, in Bangladesh. One example was when the foreign ministry was sent a letter by Belgium.
A secret military staff charged with the extermination of the Tutsi of Rwanda in order to solve forever, in their way, the ethnic problem in Rwanda and to destroy the domestic Hutu opposition.
One thing is for sure, the Hutu militias wanted murder. The following day, massacres of Tutsi civilians started. Neighbors murdering neighbors, a Hutu power group called the Interahamwe, armed with chainsaws, guns, and the icon of the genocide, machetes. A government-supported radio called RTLM, or Free Radio and Television of the Thousand Hills in English, called.
Dimanche 19 juin 1994 et il est 16h22 à Kigali dans le blindé de la FLM. Avis à tous les IND qui nous écoutent, oui, à tous les IND qui nous écoutent, le Rwanda appartient à ceux qui le défendent vraiment. Et vous les IND, vous n'êtes pas des Rwandais.
Abatwumva ko nyine abantu bose bahagurukije kurwanya inyenzi n'ababwiye abasirikare bacu nibo ba mbere, mbabwira urubyiruko rwagutse kugira ngo bafashe abasirikare bacu, mbabwira inkumi, mbabwira abasore. Murabyumva rero, inyenzi ntabwo zishobora gukandira abantu bose.
Imana tugira iwacu uko ari bake cyane, ni bake cyane ndetse nubwo twabariraga ku ijana, ku 10%, ubwo basigara 8%. Abo bantu se koko muze twishime nshuti, inkotanyi zashize, muze twishime nshuti, yewe Imana ntirenganya koko. Kuvuga hano niturwana tugatsinda inyenzi inkotanyi burundu, nazo dutwira urubanza n'ububaho kuko ruzaba turarwanya kandi batsinda.
UN peacekeepers practically did nothing to ease the situation. The UN practically gave no assistance to Rwanda, unlike the minuscule assistance they gave in Bosnia. America, after a shameful withdrawal from Somalia, wanted nothing to do with another African conflict, but at the same time also intervening in Sierra Leone for those blood diamonds. 1 million people died during the genocide, 800,000 Tutsi, 190,000 moderate Hutu, and 10,000 Twa, in the span of only 100 days. Rwanda became a bloodbath, meanwhile the international community just uselessly stood by. 500,000 women were raped, almost entirely Tutsi. Men infected with STDs were released from hospitals to commit mass essay, and usually sterilized their victims to prevent more Tutsi births. Tutsis were murdered via government identity cards. RTLM radios would usually call Tutsis cockroaches and called mass murders going to work. The RPF, in response to this genocide, attacked, and with the government being busy with their genocide, but the government forces didn't fight back. They just accelerated their slaughter of Tutsis. It was clear. This wasn't just mass murder or political violence. This was genocide. The RPF steamrolled through the country and in a month had already reached the gates of Kigali, capturing the country's main airport and military operations center in Kanombe. After a couple weeks of fighting in the capital, the RPF finally liberated Kigali. And the RPF steamrolled through the rest of the country, meanwhile France occupied the Zone Turquoise. Look, I know that 2 pages won't do the Rwandan Civil War justice, so that's why I've put some videos in the description going more into detail about it. Also, one book author I'd like to suggest reading is Linda Melvern, which a lot of the video is based off of. Okay, now let's check Rwanda after the Civil War. Psych! Over the hill, Burundi just got into a civil war, so let's delve in. Burundi had its first free and fair elections in 1993. Melchior Ndadaye became president of Burundi. This pissed off the Tutsi extremists who made up most of Burundi's military. Ndadaye had some things on his plate to balance: the Hutu nationalists and Tutsi extremists. Ndadaye chose the first option and created a coalition government merging Melchior's FNI and Hutu nationalist Palipahutu. The Tutsi-led military coup Ndadaye, where he died during the coup. In response of Ndadaye's death, Hutu militias organized street gangs in urban areas which were biracial, became separated into Hutu and Tutsi. Zaire and Tanzania supported Hutu militias, allowing them to set up bases in their countries to raid into Burundi. You might be wondering, why? Mobutu believed that he could gain more political power by hosting Hutu militias from Rwanda and Burundi. Julius Nyerere, the statesman of Tanzania, no longer president, wished to incorporate Rwanda and Burundi into Tanzania, thus merging all former German East African colonies into one, though he believed that the only way for stability in Burundi was to incorporate more Hutu into the government. After Ndadaye's death, Cyprien Ntaryamira became president of the country, and then he died in a plane crash with Habyarimana. Remember that? There was no large-scale massacres, but refugees fleeing Rwanda into Burundi further destabilized the country. Sylvester Tibatunganya was put as president with the civilian Frodebu and Uprona. It fractured and became too weak to govern the country. The military took control of what little was left. Bujumbura, the capital, and other urban areas became a terrorism hotspot for gangs, and one of those gangs were Sans-Capet. What does that mean? What the f? The Tutsi military started killing Hutus, and in brutal reciprocation, Hutus rose up and started slaughtering Tutsis. Militias being formed in refugee camps in Tanzania, an estimated 300,000 people were killed and over 500,000 displaced, about a tenth of the population. Hutu gangs forming a militia in Bujumbura, Tutsi gangs targeting displaced Hutus, Burundi and Rwanda effectively became failed states. Okay, how's Rwanda after the civil war? 1.5 million Hutu extremists and the government responsible for the genocide fled to Zaire, mainly in Goma and Bukavu. France kept the southwestern corner of Rwanda called Zone Turquoise. Many Rwandans saw France as protecting Hutus and people who participated in the genocide from the RPF. Hostilities between France and Rwanda would remain until the French left on August 21st in 1994. Rwanda feared that if the Burundian government collapsed, it would become a base for pro-Hutu militias to attack into Rwanda, especially northern Burundi. Most of these rebels, as I mentioned earlier, were settled in Zaire. Rwanda, with its hands tied, invaded Zaire on October 24th, 1996. Whoa. How could such a small country invade a country 90 times bigger than it? Okay, a little backstory. Mobutu Sese Seko came to power in a coup in 1965. The US supported Mobutu for his anti-communist stance. Mobutu was extremely corrupt and authoritarian. And I don't mean that as a buzzword. During his reign from independence in 1960 to 1997, Zaire's GDP decreased by 65%. After the Cold War ended, the US had no interest in supporting Mobutu, favoring new leaders, as a wave of democratization hit the African continent in the 1990s. Mobutu's health was declining, political environment changing, and loss of allies domestically and abroad. Zaire was running politically and economically bankrupt. The eastern parts of the country were practically ungovernable, giving way to the Mai Mai Rebellion, which hosted Hutu genocidaires. Zaire and Tutsis rebelled against Hutu extremists who had newly arrived. Mobutu being unpopular, it went from a Tutsi rebellion to a larger revolution in Zaire. The ADFL, created in Kigali with the help of Uganda and American intel, started a rebellion in the Congo. Now this war was continental. Zaire against Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, Eritrea, South Sudanese independence fighters, and Angola because of supporting rebels in the country. Countries also giving non-military assistance to the anti-Mobutu coalition were Ethiopia, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, and Zambia. And who were supporting Zaire? Sudan, Central African Republic, France, China, and Israel and Kuwait, monetarily. Safe to say, Mobutu was fucked. The ADFL steamrolled through the country, though progress was slowed down by the crippling infrastructure and effectively no control over the country. ADFL forces slowed down their attacks to destroy refugee camps suspect of housing Hutu genociders. Sudanese fighters were kicked out the country, who then fled to Juba. Foreign mercenaries were used on both sides, for Zaire to fill the experience gap and for Rwanda to fill in manpower, cause you know. Zaire had only 50,000 soldiers at the start of the war, though only 20,000 of them were experienced enough to fight. The Mai Mai also split between pro-Hutu and pro-RPF sides. The coalition had already captured major cities along the border and advancing into the Congo rainforest to Kisangani. Angola declared war on Zaire, coalition forces advanced to Kasai and afterwards started a spearhead towards Lubumbashi with the assistance of Zambia. It was just a matter of time when Zaire would collapse, coalition forces spearheading through Mbandaka and Kenge, capturing Kinshasa on May 17, 1997. After the overthrow of Mobutu and the fall of Zaire, the Democratic Republic of the Congo was proclaimed, and Laurent Désiré Kabila was installed as the president. In the other Congo, the People's Republic of the Congo had a civil war due to Mobutu's forces retreating into the country, with Hutu militia fighting alongside the ruling leader. As a cause of the war, which happened in former Zaire, which ended with the incumbent president still in office as of writing of this script, Kabila was just as corrupt, with the DRC's economy still stagnating, inheriting a massive external debt. Foreign militaries did not budge at defection requests. Congolese started to get pissed at the Rwandan military presence in Kinshasa, seeing Kabila as a pawn for foreign powers. 14th of July, Congolese and Rwandan relations hit a new lull when Kabila replaced his Rwandan chief of staff with the Congolese, though the same Rwandan chief of staff was given another position to soften the blow. 2 weeks later, Kabila ordered all Rwandan and Ugandan forces out of the country in 24 hours. This alerted Congolese Tutsis. It looked like this would be another repeat of the First Congolese War. 2nd of August 1998, the Banyamulenge erupted into rebellion. Rwanda immediately offered the rebels assistance, with backing from Rwanda and Uganda took over the Kivus. Dude, are you thinking of what I'm thinking? No. What if we airdropped on the other side of the country, taking the Congolese by surprise, and then we spearhead Kinshasa and win? Dude, are you crazy? That won't fucking work. And that's exactly what they did. In Operation Kitona, 3 civilian planes were hijacked, and as the name implies, Rwandan forces were airdropped to Kitona military base and started an assault to Kinshasa. Angola, Zimbabwe, and Namibia intervened into the conflict, stopping the Rwandan advance. Rwandan forces stayed in the Angolan jungle until late 1998 to be airdropped back to Rwanda. With the Congo temporarily distracted in Bas-Congo, Kisangani was taken by Ugandan forces. A couple weeks later, Chad, Libya, and Sudan joined in the side of Kabila. The war ended in a stalemate. Nations in the conflict agreed on a ceasefire in Windhoek, Namibia in January 18, 1999. The RCD Ugandan-supported rebels moved from Rwandan-controlled Goma to Ugandan-controlled Bunia. In 1999, the warring countries came to the negotiating table again and signed the Lusaka Agreements, signed by the 6 warring nations. In the agreement, all countries will come together in a joint military commission and manage disarming and documenting all military forces in the Congo, and especially genociders who played a role in the Rwandan Genocide. Again, clashes fight out. This time it's the Ugandan and Rwandan militaries fighting over Kisangani. The battle would last for 4 days and then both sides signed a ceasefire. On April 22nd of 2000, Paul Kagame becomes the president of Rwanda. In November, a government-controlled television claimed that Kabila had rebuilt his army and that it was ready to liberate the country. A Rwandan offensive towards the capital was repelled. On 24th November 2000, the UN set up 5,500 to monitor ceasefire. Fighting continued in the country. A government offensive in August the same year failed to make any headway. Kabila was assassinated in Kinshasa in January 16, 2001. The suspect of who planned the assassination are quite unclear. Some blame Rwanda, UNITA, and some Lebanese diamond tycoon. His son Joseph Kabila was sworn in as president, most likely by the backing of Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe. Rwanda's allies in the war started to slow down, and things weren't going as Rwanda expected. So in July 2002, the DRC and Rwanda signed the Pretoria Accords. Rwanda agreed to withdraw its forces from the DRC, and in exchange, the international community would put an effort to disarming the Hutu militias. The conflict left an aftermath of disease and malnutrition that still lingers to this day. The Second Congo War, or the Great African War, was the deadliest conflict in history since World War II, causing 5.4 million casualties. Rwanda after the war was devastated. Survival became the everyday task of the average Rwandan. Women mainly took the role of breadwinner because the men they knew were dead, in prison or in exile. As stores and pharmacies rushed to fill their stocks amid electricity and water rationing, revenge killings related to the genocide became an everyday reality. Rwanda financially was completely bankrupt, with humanitarian aid nowhere to be seen, with foreign governments scared of the RPF using the money to retaliate against Hutu opposition. Foreign debt repayments became a major problem for the new government. The IMF and World Bank refused to give Rwanda any more loans unless they repaid their pre-genocide debt, which was basically impossible. Most humanitarian organizations were concerned with the crisis in Zaire during the First Congo War. Most refugee camps were controlled by Hutu extremists, where most UN workers disappeared or were killed. 90% of UN camps in Zaire had no access to healthcare. Most humanitarian organizations didn't want to explain why they were funding an ethnic war in a small East African country, so the RPF were very precarious with their wording. Foreign cash only started to flow into the country on November 1994 when the EU repealed the deadlock in giving Rwanda $88 million in aid. Only then did multilateral aid get sent to Rwanda. $1 billion in aid was given, which accounted for 96% of the country's budget from 1994 to 1996. The international technical experts were sent to Rwanda, and that started confliction between donors and the RPF. The government preferred to assign citizens that it trusted to fill these jobs, building basic services from the ground up, and securing the borders. The foreign inability to understand the flesh and blood, visceral worldview of a regime that had won a narrow victory against the genocidal regime that still survived. These conflictions would still affect donor and Rwanda relations to this day. The RPF stressed in speeches for Rwanda's self-reliance and resilience, and that Rwanda would reject colonial mentalities of depending on outsiders. In 1995, only $245 million of the $1 billion pledged to Rwanda was given. The RPF saw this as a lack of confidence in the new government by outside parties. Most of the aid money in the region was being used to maintain refugee camps in Tanzania, Burundi, and Zaire. From then on, Rwanda and UN relations have been cold, with the RPF leadership saying that they have a deep distrust with the UN, and understandably so. The RPF started forming a multi-ethnic government in 1994. The Arusha courts described that Rwanda would have a democratic government, which was at the appeasement of many outsiders but an annoyance for Kagame, for who democracy was not a concern. The RPF's job was security first, even if it meant invading neighboring Zaire. Kagame acknowledged that a Tutsi minority government was in charge of a Hutu majority population, put efforts into national unity and reconciliation. In an interview with Philip Gorovich, Kagame said, "If I wanted to be a problem, then I would become an actual problem." Kagame banned the MRND of Habyarimana and Hutu parapolitical parties. Opposition parties were allowed in the new National Unity Government, RANU. RANU's first actions was to fulfill the multi-ethnic requirement of the Arusha courts. The president before Kagame was a Hutu in the post-genocide Rwanda. Now, let's skip to the new millennium. Up to this point, Burundi's civil war was still ongoing. Not really a civil war, but more of an insurgency, with the Arusha courts failing to bring peace to Burundi. In January 2005, a lot of progress on the peace progress was made. A new national military was set up, and the nationwide midnight curfew was lifted. The civil war ended with the last rebel group, FNL, signing a ceasefire in Tanzania, ending the civil war, though they would continue a low-level insurgency. Okay, let's check on how Rwanda plans on reconstructing. The RPF moved towards easing the access of public services, and it was every citizen's duty to participate in national unity and development initiatives. The RPF built Rwanda from the backbone of justice and security, which were needed for economic development. Empowering Rwandan citizens was the main goal of the RPF, so the people could resist the vices of poor leadership, which was one of the reasons of the Rwandan Genocide. Boniface, a Tutsi businessman who came back from exile in Uganda, said,
"We would rather be conscious of our enemy than naively pretend, like you foreigners, to think we have no enemy out there planning to exterminate us, but instead hopelessly fantasize about a utopian Rwanda."
The RPF had all hands on deck. The NURC, which was responsible to put policies of reviving Rwanda to life. In 1999, a 20-year plan called Vision 2020 was drafted by the Finance Ministry. Its goal was to make Rwanda a middle-income country, so how did Rwanda go about it? Rwanda's largest sector is agriculture, developing it from subsistence to mass farming. Apart from some gold and tin deposits, Rwanda practically has no resources. Burundian, Rwandan, and Ugandan troops have been benefiting from exporting cobalt from the Kivu region, supported by multinational conglomerates and foreign countries, further worsening the situation in the Congo. In 2001, the UN banned mineral exports from Rwanda. Manufacturing went up by 80% in 2001 from 1993 levels. Main products were
cement, roofing sheets, housing shingles, and other industrial supplies intended to fuel infrastructure repairs.
The RPF planned on resuming its presence in the Congo but reversed its decision. The Dutch and the British were the only countries to suspend aid in Rwanda. By 2006, the Rwandan economy started to see massive growth. It was also considered unpatriotic to oppose or complain about the RPF. The RPF exchanged political support for growth, peace, and stability, which was rooted since the Precolonial Era, and also became Africa's Singapore in some way, not only politically but economically. Both are small, one is developed and the other is developing. The laws have been criticized by freedom rights organizations with false arrests for free speech. State and government are synonyms in Rwanda, and it's being called omnipresent. The treatment of rural Rwandans is comparable to a parent trying to correct a child, at least for the RPF.
I do not look at the poor people and deal with them. In fact, when I worked with the ministry, I did not have to look at the poor. That was the level of policies and decisions. It is now in this new function that I am directly confronted with the poor.
The government put in some finable bills, some of them made sense, but like, what the hell is drinking beer at home or in a bar with a straw? I guess they took Singapore of Africa quite literally. In 1993, Rwanda's population density was 225 people per square kilometer, and now it's double that at 535 people per square kilometer, beating South Korea and neighboring Burundi by a small margin. In 2008, massive infrastructure projects were built. Since 2006, rural poverty has decreased by 12%. 600,000 out of 11.5 million people were lifted out of poverty in just 5 years. Rwanda's economy has grown by 8% every year since the start of the new millennium, considering that it's quite easy to build back from rock bottom, and is still one of the fastest growing countries in the world. Okay, what about neighboring Burundi? In 2004, the African Union sent a mission in Burundi to monitor a ceasefire which broke out. And in what spanned 2 years later, 6 FNL rebels were killed by government forces. In September 7, 2006, a ceasefire was signed in Dar es Salaam, which officially ended the insurgency. And then another one popped up with the same Hutu, and 30,000 people were displaced during the conflict. After a ceasefire, the Hutu renamed themselves to the FNL and got registered as a legal political party. District elections were set up. In 2015, there were 6 candidates in this presidential election. The FNL, the opposition party, threatened to boycott the presidential elections. The CNDD announced that the incumbent, Pierre Nkurunziza, would stay as president for a 3rd term, and a lot of nations suspended aid because of it. In 2019, Burundi changed its capital from Bujumbura back to Gitega. Though Bujumbura is still its primate city, you'd know about it if you watched this video. Because of the crisis, Burundi was too busy fighting itself. From military to political chaos today, 90% of the population depend on subsistence agriculture to feed themselves, due to the lack of food security. 90% of the economy is made up by agriculture, employing about 80% of the country. Burundi ranks at the bottom of the barrel in terms of HDI, at 0.273, lower than Yemen and Afghanistan. I mean, it's an improvement from genocide era 0.257 or Rwanda 0.189. Rwanda is now a fast developing country with a growth rate of 8.2%. Kigali is Africa's cleanest city. It is the first country to have a woman majority government in all positions. The Rwandan aspiration to become the Singapore of Africa most likely will become true. Though Rwanda's support of M23 is a big negative on its image, profiting from illegal mining in the Congo, wonder who's paying for them. Burundi meanwhile is at the bottom of the barrel when it comes to statistics, with crippling corruption. Maybe Burundi can take a page off of Rwanda's books. So kids, what's the moral of the story?
Kill the corrupt!
And thanks for watching.